This is the recording of pages 47 to 53. We're in part 1, chapter 3, Working, Trading, and Building in Sumer. We've seen how historians go about the business of piecing together the past. They follow a trail of questions, always seeking evidence to answer those questions. Sometimes a question leads to unexpected directions. You've seen, for example, how historians and archaeologists started out asking questions about Babylon and stumbled onto Sumer. Now, let's take a closer look at mysterious Sumer, the place where civilization began. We'll have to do some more detective work. After all, to reach back 500,000 years, we need to ask some probing questions. How did the Sumerians use the land? What did they produce? What kinds of jobs did they do? Did the Sumerians believe in one god or many? Could they read and write? Who governed them? Did they have laws? These are the sorts of questions we'll be asking to discover more about Sumerian culture. Culture everywhere. Every society has a culture of its own. A culture is a people's whole way of life. Their culture includes the things that they do and the ideas that guide them. It includes their habits and customs, their religion and education, their art and music. Our own society has a unique culture. The books you read, the music you hear on the radio, and the shows you see on TV are all part of our culture. So are the laws we have, and our ideas about right and wrong, and the lessons taught by schools and churches, the language we speak, and the ways we communicate with each other, from using telephones and the internet to magazines and advertising, are all part of our culture today. Since a culture is a people's whole way of life, it includes many different things. The chart on this page lists important questions that can be used to study any culture. In this chapter, we'll ask some basic questions about geography and economy to take a closer look at ancient Sumer. In later chapters, we'll ask more questions that guide us in our study of past cultures. So take a moment to read over the chart and make sure you understand all the key words. Now we're ready to begin our detective work. We know what questions to ask about the Sumerians. Let's see if we can find some answers. So questions you want to ask about geography. What's the land like? How did people use it? Where do they live? The economy, what goods are produced? How are goods produced? How are goods exchanged or traded? Who benefits from trade? Is money used? How is wealth distributed? Religion and philosophy. What do the people believe about God or the gods? What do they believe about the meaning of life? What do they believe about right and wrong? How do their beliefs affect their lives? Knowledge, education, and the arts. Have the people developed any new knowledge? What kind of knowledge do they think is important? What can we learn about them from their painting, sculpture, building, music, or writing? How do they communicate with each other? Can people read? Are there schools? Government and laws. How are the people governed? Do they have laws? Who holds power and how is power distributed? And then society. Do the people live in groups such as families or clans? Are there rich people and poor people? Are there many in the middle? Are there slaves? Technology. What major inventions or innovations have been made? For what purposes? How have these inventions and innovations changed life in this society? And then history. Is there much change in the society? In what ways is society changing? Is the society changing slowly or quickly? All right, so those are questions to ask. All right, putting the land and water to work. The Sumerians learned to do something quite amazing for their times. They figured out how to control the yearly flooding of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. They built thick earth walls or levees to hold back the waters of the spring floods. They also dug canals to carry water to the fields in fall and winter. With this system, they had just enough water for their crops. It surely wasn't an easy task. It must have taken years and years of back-breaking labor under the blazing sun to build all the levees and canals. They managed to do it only by learning to work together, by helping one another. They were able to put the land to good use and take advantage of their physical environment. Only by dividing the labor could Sumerians have created the world's first civilization. Even people who lived long before the Sumerians knew that the division of labor was a good idea. The early hunter-gatherers divided the work. Women looked after the children and searched for wild grains, fruit, and nuts, while the men hunted and fished. But the Sumerians went much further than the hunter-gatherers. They carried the division of labor further than any group had before. We can tell from the levees, canals, and fields the Sumerians left behind that they worked hard to use the resources around them. Large teams of workers cultivated the land, irrigating the fields, and harvested the crops. The results were wonderful. The Sumerians grew plenty of wheat and barley in the irrigated soil. For the first time in history, people produced a surplus of food, more food than people could consume at one time. The surplus of grain kept increasing, and that profoundly affected life in Sumer. For one thing, it meant that not every Sumerian had to be a farmer. Some of the people were able to grow enough food for everyone, so the rest of the Sumerians were free to work at other jobs. Some became skilled craftsmen, such as carpenters, metal workers, or potters. Some made cloth. Some tended sheep or raised cattle. Some became priests, soldiers, or doctors. Some became merchants, boatmen, or writers. All these people were able to eat by doing their own special type of work in exchange for food. Soon, more and more people were gathering in villages and towns to sell their wares, store their grain, and bargain for food. Villages and towns became cities. The urban edge. Cities make it simpler. These first ancient cities with mysterious names such as Uruk, Kish, Lagash, and Umma became energetic centers of life. They brought several advantages too. With thousands of people together in a single place, more people could work together to accomplish bigger tasks. More people could do more and produce more. In an urban or city environment, many people had a place to store their grain, sell their pots and baskets, fashion their jewelry, and worship their gods. And division of labor allowed the Sumerians to focus on particular tasks, such as weaving. And here's an artwork of someone weaving. Sumerians proved to be excellent city builders. By 3500 BC, they lived in city-states. Each city-state was made of a city and the land around it. Each had its own ruler or king. Sumerian kings were ambitious. They surrounded their cities with high protective walls, safe from attacks by outsiders. They built large granaries and beautiful temples. These ancient city-states teemed with activity. Sumerian poems tell of lofty gates and wide boulevards that were filled with parades and feasts at special times of the year. In the best part of town stood colorfully decorated temples and a few grand homes with flowering gardens and columned courtyards. The archaeological evidence tells us, however, that most of the streets in Sumerian cities were narrow, winding, and unpaved. Little one-story flat-roofed houses stood next to two-story buildings. The houses were made of mud brick, which kept the residents cooler in the hot, dry land of Sumer. Craftsmen and merchants sold their wares from open booths that lined the narrow lanes. Outside the large walled cities lay smaller villages and settlements, along with the rich fields of wheat and barley laced with canals. In the fields, efficient farmers produced food for themselves and the city folk. And here we've got a picture that kind of shows everything that's going on. And here's this artifact highlights two examples of Sumerian ingenuity. The upper panel shows use of the wheel, which was invented in Sumer, and the lower panel depicts soldiers wearing what may have been the world's first body armor. And then down here, like the two merchants in this relief, the Sumerians spent much time trading goods. Their surpluses of food and cloth allowed them to trade for metals and other rare items. Reaching beyond the borders, the land of Sumer had rich soil, water for irrigation, and a long, hot growing season. However, it lacked some important resources. For example, there were no metals and no tall trees, and there was not much stone in Sumer. The Sumerians needed these things, and slowly they learned how they could get them through trade. The Sumerians had a surplus of grain and cloth, so they began to trade some of their grain and cloth for the timber, stone, metals, and other things they lacked. It took many centuries for trade to develop between the Sumerians and other peoples. During that time, the Sumerians learned how to transport goods over long distances. They invented the wheel, which meant they could use carts and wagons. They discovered how to make sailboats too, which meant they could transport goods on the rivers and sea. Sumerian merchants began bringing stone and wood down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers from the northern mountains. Cedar wood came from the area that is now the country of Lebanon. Gold came from east of the country now called Iran, and possibly from Asia Minor. Silver, copper, and tin came from faraway lands. The beautiful blue stone known as lapis lazuli came from what is now the country of Afghanistan. In later centuries, some Sumerian merchants may have traveled as far as the Indus Valley, where they could buy spices, dyes, and jewels. With the materials they acquired through trade, the Sumerians did marvelous things. Some craftsmen learned how to make beautiful vases and lamps out of copper and bronze, while others learned how to carve wood or stone. The Sumerians made statues and tools out of their new materials. They made weapons and armor, jewelry and furniture. Archaeologists have uncovered many of the things they made. Take some time to examine the pictures of Sumerian artifacts in this book. The first, money. Barter was the earliest form of trading. When people barter, they trade without using money. For example, a farmer might give some sacks of grain to a carpenter in exchange for a couple of chairs. Or a doctor might agree to take care of a patient in return for 3 sheep. Sometimes barter is still used in today's modern economy. In general, however, we use money to conduct business because it's much more convenient than trading things like sheep or sacks of grain. Money is a medium of exchange. That is, it's something that anyone can take in exchange for goods or work, and then use to buy something else. As their civilization expanded, the ancient Sumerians needed a medium of exchange too. For a time, they used barley, which is a grain. They learned that almost everyone, and that goes on to the next page, and then here's pictures of the blue stones, the lapis lazuli. And here's producing a surplus, tips for Sumerian farmers. Advice assembled from numerous fragments of Sumerian clay tablets. Before you begin cultivating your field, watch carefully the opening of the dikes, ditches, and mounts so that you will not flood the field with too much water. After draining the water from your field, let sodden oxen trample it for you to loosen the weeds and level the ground. While your field is drying, prepare the tools you will need. When your field is ready for planting, add an extra ox to the plow ox. When one ox is harnessed to a second ox, the plow is larger. After your field has been harrowed and raked 3 times and the ground pulverized fine with a hammer, tolerate no idleness in your field laborers. If necessary, stand over them with a whip and allow no interruptions. Furthermore, do not expect your field workers to serve you. Since they must work day and night for 10 days, their strength should be saved for the planting. After the grain has begun to sprout, pray to the goddess Ninkilim and shoo away the flying birds. Okay, we'll talk about that in the lesson. Let's see. So they learned that almost everyone would take barley in exchange for goods. Sumerians paid their workers in barley. They baked their bread and brewed their beer from barley. The merchants used surplus barley to trade for things they wanted. Barley, however, was not a very convenient medium of exchange. Large amounts of it were heavy. If the barley were not carefully stored, it could spoil. It was hard to handle and transport over long distances, so after a while the Sumerians started looking around for something else they could use. Sumerian merchants found that silver would be accepted almost everywhere. As a medium of exchange, it was much better than barley. It was easier to use, easier to carry, and did not spoil. It didn't take up as much room either. Silver was valuable because it was a precious metal. It was precious because it was scarce. Sumerians weighed out the silver as they needed it. Later, they began using small bars of silver. They also wore silver coils like bracelets around their arms. They could snap off bits of a coil and use the pieces to buy things. These silver bars and bits of coil may well have been the first pieces of metal money in history. A tiny few at the top. As we've seen, the Sumerians had more than enough food, and they used their surplus to trade. That made them a wealthy civilization, but not all Sumerians were wealthy. In fact, most of them weren't. In Sumer, there were some rich people, but there were far more poor people. Out of every 100 men and women in Sumer, the vast majority were agricultural workers. Some of these workers were slaves, but slaves and free workers spent long, hard days digging all those canals and bending over the crops in the fields. They plowed the land and planted and watered. It was their sweat and labor that produced the food surplus necessary for civilization to develop. Yet most had just enough food to stay alive. They enjoyed few of the beautiful things that civilization brought some Sumerians, such as the golden jewelry and copper vases that archaeologists dig up today. Who then were the wealthy Sumerians? Who were the tiny few at the top who held most of the power and gained most from the trade and surplus of food? In ancient Sumer, almighty governors and kings held much of the wealth and made many decisions about how things should be done. They told everyone else when to plant the fields, where to dig the canals, and how to water the crops. Priests and scribes were powerful too. The people held priests in high regard because they believed priests could communicate with the gods. Scribes were the knowledgeable class. They could read and write. Even the kings and priests couldn't do that. In the next chapter, we'll learn more about the Sumerians' ideas about society. In the meantime, take a moment to learn about work, trade, and building in Sumer by reading the story of a beautiful bead. And we'll continue that in the next reading. This is the end of the reading of page 47 to 53.